Today to introduce Dr. Mike Bueno. Dr. Bueno is a clinical assistant professor with the UCI Sue and Bill Gross School of Nursing, and he will be speaking to us today on caregiving satisfaction, caregiving fatigue, coping strategies, and resources. And it is really my pleasure to welcome Dr. Bueno.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction. Just a little bit more about myself. Yes, I am a clinical professor for the School of Nursing. I've been teaching for about the past 6 to 7 years already. But in my doctoral preparation for my PhD, I really focused on caregivers and caregiver health and looking at the different demographics on how they perceive their caregiving role and how best for the future we can address their health needs, because we understand our caregivers come in different shapes, sizes, colors, what have you, and we'll touch a little bit more about that as we go through this. So focusing on satisfaction, fatigue, and some of the strategy and resources, there really is a lot out there. So I'm going to try my best to keep it in a short, basic format for us to consume, really just to understand the basics of what they are. Next slide, please. So the objectives, what I'm going to cover, we're going to go over some signs and symptoms of caregiver burnout and fatigue, what it looks like, and in general terms, because they will look fairly different for everyone. And then identify some self-coping strategies to help address some of these, something that we can do or at least understand where to turn to. And then the third objective is to identify where these resources are and what's really out there for the caregivers that we come across. Next slide, please. First, I want to go over just some facts and figures to understand the gravity of who our caregivers are, and what impact they play within our society and basically the whole world, really. But here in the US, if we take a look at the quick numbers here, according to the Administration for Community Living, in 2018, there were about 52.4 million people age 65 and older, which is up from 38.8 million in 2008. So we're seeing this drastic rise of our older adult population. And if you look at this 52.4 million people, to give you a little bit more context, just imagine that this is twice the size of the population of the state of Texas. So if you take that, that is a lot of caregivers, and that's gonna be needed to help care for these older adults. This population of older adults is projected to reach up to 80.8 million by the year 2040, and then 94.7 million by the year 2060. So we can see this exponential growth. If we look at this, an aging population presents a lot of issues, a lot of its economic, social, and familial challenges due to this increased risk of age-related diseases and just the needs of older adults as they age. Which puts a lot of pressure, not just for the person who is getting older, but their caregivers, the family members, the people they come in contact with, professional providers like us and all of you who are trying to provide assistance for them. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go over, let's take a look at who our caregivers are. And apologize for some of the animations. It was a little bit fancy, but transferring over it might not make sense. But we'll take a quick look at who our caregivers are. Next slide. So the first one, when we take a look at the gender, so the gender of our caregivers are starting to look very different. Although the majority of our caregivers are still women, there's this trend, upward trend of how that's starting to get a little bit more balanced, albeit slow, but we're starting to see more men entering this caregiving role. About 5 years ago, the percentage of male caregivers about 34, and the most recent numbers that's come out is up to 39. So we can kind of see this 1% rise every year up till now. The interesting fact about this is, as more men are entering the caregiving role, some of what their needs are going to be a little bit different. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple more slides. But the thing is, additionally, younger caregivers tend to be male. So if we're looking at younger ones, we're starting to see more of these younger men taking over some of these caregiver roles for their family members. And I do some research looking specifically at male caregivers. And what's I find interesting is a lot of these men, a lot of them are grandkids that are starting to take care of their aging grandparents. Um, and these guys are coming out just in this new role. As we think about how caregiving can be gendered, we're starting to mix, and the research is still needed out there to really understand this new role for a lot of people, not just men, but other people who are having to take care of older family members. So as we're seeing this big shift, a lot, we're trying to change that mindset of what a typical caregiver looks like. No longer is it just the wife or the granddaughter or the daughter that's taking care of their loved one. We're starting to see different faces to come across and who to understand, and not stereotype what a caregiver is. Next slide, please. One more, I believe. There we go. So we're now looking to middle. Our caregivers now, with the aging population, we're seeing a big shift in more of a balance of who our caregivers are based on their age and generation they are in. So these caregivers span across many age groups. And you can see it's kind of mostly driven by our aging baby boomers. Another interesting thing that we're starting to come across is with this aging baby boomers, we're getting a sense of caregivers within this sandwich generation. Sandwich generation meaning that not only are they caring for a parent or a grandparent, but they're also at the same time taking care of a child or a grandchild. So we're seeing a lot more of the sandwich generation of caregivers in the middle, like Gen X, millennials, looking into those, having to caregive for multiple people in their family as well. Another fact here is about half of the caregivers in this report, this was taken from AARP, say that there are others who also provide unpaid help, not just the typical child, spouse, brother, sister. From the statistics that they gathered, out of those that they surveyed, about 14% of them say at least one of those unpaid caregivers is a child under the age of 18. So something that is not being covered. So this could be someone who could, like someone in grade school who is helping out their parent taking care of a grandparent, just because how busy the main caregiver is. So what this means is there's additional 3.4 million child caregivers that is not typically involved in a lot of these statistics. So if you can think about that, there's you might come across a younger child who we don't really consider as a caregiver, but they are playing an integral part in helping their family members take care of an older loved one, with physical stuff or with just help around the house. So we're starting to see these younger kids play an important role in caregivers as well. Next slide. So another area that caregiving has a significant impact is financially. This could be in the form of paying for care. It could also be time for respite care. A lot of caregivers really, when we talk about how self-coping strategies, majority of the time is they just want time. So trying to find the ability to take a break and find that respite care, so they can get away and do other things outside of just taking care of their loved one. But financially as well, another big aspect that's affecting them would be how caregiving can cause a lot of disruptions with work in their professional life. This could either be coming in late or having, there's a growing number of people who are having to quit altogether just because the demands of caregiving is just so much that it's very difficult to manage a full-time schedule on top of being a full-time caregiver at home as well. So there are, financial disruptions, a lot of it when it comes to caregiving. Next slide. So now taking a look at caregiver satisfaction, although this is just a very short slide, because the majority of the literature that's out there really focuses on the negative impacts of caregiving, really just because it's, that's what's really affecting caregiver health. They're looking at the negative side of it. But there are positive sides of being a caregiver that's shown in research and the literature as well. Some positive that was brought up is it provides a purpose. A lot of these caregivers just being needed at certain times is something that they felt that um, they're 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 doing something good for someone else, more even more so for a loved one, right? And then feeling of accomplishment, something that they're able to succeed, making sure that their family member is being fed, being bathed, they're getting um, the right kind of care is just a positive aspect of being a caregiver, making sure that they're succeeding at something, right? Another set of positives for being a caregiver is this fulfillment of obligation. Whether it be, I've talked to a lot of caregivers, would it be, just fulfilling their vow if they are a spouse, their marriage vows, like this is, I'm obligated to take care of my spouse. And this is what makes me feel good because I'm living up to those expectations when I took my vows. Other caregivers, especially for the younger ones that I talk to, is even if it's for a child caregiver or grandchild, it's they're fulfilling obligation or they're paying it back, so to speak, quote unquote, that either their parent or grandparent helped raise them. This is one way to give back is it's a reciprocal. They were helped being raised by the grandparent or their parent. Now they're giving it back. One of my research recent studies that I've done when I interviewed some of these, we're getting a lot of these grandkids that are coming in who, especially when you look at different demographics, if you look at certain kind of populations, when they have a grandparent who's going to be probably the main person looking after them as they grew up because the parents were working, this is one of the ways that they can pay back their grandparents is to caregive for them in their older age, is what I'm finding in some of these younger caregivers. So it's that fulfillment of obligation is something that they felt good about, that they're able to give back, especially if their parents were so busy with working. That, just like myself, my grandparents raised me pretty much because my parents were out there working so hard that, as I caregive for my grandparents, I felt good about fulfilling the obligation and giving it back, paying it back to them for the time and sacrifice for raising me. And then there are some studies out there that, just caregiving for someone, especially a loved one, especially unpaid because, they're not being recognized. It's just helping them fulfill that improved relationship between them and whoever they're taking care of, whether it be a parent, a brother or sister, a grandparent as well. When I've done, again, some of my research, when I've talked to, interviewed some of these caregivers, they actually said that their relationship improved over time, just because they were around them so much more often, and they get to see that satisfaction from being able to take care of someone and talk to them. Yeah, it does change depending on what the older adult is needing caregiving for, but in the overall consensus, they're feeling that the relationship got stronger, not only with that person that they're taking care of, but some even said that it improved their relationship with other family members, other brothers and sisters, because they are sharing some of the work, or their siblings or another family member understands how much work they're going through. So it helps improve some of the other types of familial relationships as well, which is a positive of being a caregiver. Next slide. But now this is where the brunt of it, because this is where a lot of the literature focuses on, which is the negative aspect of caregiving. Although caregiving provides much needed help for people living with disease, there are these negative consequences that can occur due to its very demanding role. The collection of these consequences is what makes up the term caregiver burnout. So although you might hear some of these, which would be synonymous with each other. So other terms you might hear is caregiver fatigue, caregiver burden, or caregiver stress. And it's all pretty much sums up a collection of some of these feelings of the negative aspects of being a caregiver. And according to the AARP, in the past 5 years, there was a significant decrease in a number of these caregivers who considered the health to be excellent or very good. And then consequently, there was an increase in caregivers who reported their health to be fair or poor. So we're seeing this this result where their caregivers are reporting more and more of their quality of life being affected because of their caregiving role. The result of this caregiver strain, burnout, fatigue, stress, whatever you call it, is an increased risk of developing some of these negative health illnesses. And a lot of literature has, shown it contributes to increased risk of stress, physical, mental, emotional stress, increase in the incidence of anxiety, and then depression developed depending on just the severity of their caregiving role, or how often they have to, how often there was disruptions in their life. There could be increased risk in a lot of these detrimental health effects. There were some studies that even found that the caregiving stress from a lot of what they had to do has been linked to also an increase in stress biomarkers. And some of these biomarkers also increase the risk for developing other health symptoms, such as cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, and other physical disabilities as well. So you can kind of see all these links to a lot of some negative health effects from this caregiving role. Next slide. So some signs and symptoms of caregiver stress or fatigue can be very difficult to pick up unless you're really seeing this over a long period of time. You can see these changes in behaviors. But sometimes if you interact with some people, even just a couple of times, you can start to see some of these changes in how they interact, or how they look, some of their body language, things like that. So one thing you can start to see is changes in behavior. The person could be more withdrawn. Sometimes family members or friends will tell you that compared to the person themselves, that they're more withdrawn, that they're less, either because they are feeling some of the stress from being a caregiver, but maybe the increase in time that's needed to help someone else. So they're starting to see them less. They're starting to see them less at social functions. Things like that, they're starting to be more withdrawn within their life, socially and physically. You can kind of tell. They could have expressed or kind of seen it through some of their interactions that they're starting to feel a little bit more hopeless, that this is never going to end. I've heard some of these quotes from some of these caregivers that they're saying that I feel like this is just an ongoing, nightmare sometimes, that the stress is unrelenting. It gets more difficult. I don't know if I see a light at the end of the tunnel. Some of these sayings could come out just because they're so overwhelmed with what they have to do. You can tell these mood swings as well. Sometimes you can, their character can change over a period of time just because of that stress that they're having to deal with. It could just be due to how they interact with their loved one who they're taking care of, and they can lash out or just have a immediate change in attitude depending on what you're doing with them or what you're saying to them. So some of these, emotional attitude changes can happen as well. Another sign or symptom you can see is a lack of energy. Yes, because caregiving can be physically, emotionally, and mentally challenging. Some of these caregivers could be just complaining of lack of energy, or they just don't want to do anything else. They feel so tired. Even those times of respite, they don't even want to go out or do anything social. They just want to rest. They just want to nap. They just want to go to sleep. These are the things that you can kind of hear from them, or they just look like they haven't got much sleep in the past couple of days, weeks. They can, and that leads me to the next one: sleep issues. Although they might be tired, that it was just the stress or even just the demands of who they're taking care of. They could have disruption in their sleep patterns, or problems even going to sleep or staying asleep. Some of these caregivers have said that they wake up in the middle of the night just because they're worried, even if the person they're taking care of didn't need them. They have this worrisome, especially if their loved one is diagnosed with something that could be unpredictable. For instance, they're taking care of someone with Alzheimer's dementia who gets up in the middle of the night, um, who have escape issues. I've talked to some of these caregivers who really can't sleep because they're so worried their parent or spouse might escape. Things like that. They just disruption in sleep. And then there's these physical and emotional self-neglect. We hear a lot of times that I've said that they spend so much time taking care of their loved one, they have no time for themselves anymore, even to take care of their own physical health needs as well. Could be changes in their eating habits, weight loss, weight gain, things like that, or just having to deal with unhealthy food choices, which Meals on Wheels is. I'm glad you guys are doing a tremendous help to some of these caregivers, but you can kind of see even depending on where they live and what's available to them. Some of them, because they don't have time, they rely on fast food or something that's quick and easy because they have to get back to taking care of their loved one. So you can kind of see some of these changes in eating habits. They start to develop because of the strain or the physical demands, what have you, develop headaches, stomach aches, or other physical problems just because of that demanding role. And then with the increase in stress and what I mentioned with that, some studies show the increase in stress biomarkers, lower resistance to illness, so they can start getting sick more often. They start to take less care of themselves or take the proper precautions. What's very important, the past 2 years we've been dealing with COVID, and some of these caregivers have expressed that they don't have time to put on a mask sometimes, especially if they have to run, especially if it's a safety issue with a loved one that they're taking care of. So some of these things could really affect their own health. And show some signs and symptoms. So you can come across some of these caregivers who are, getting sick more often, not just the type of sickness, but how often they get sick as well. So these are just some signs and symptoms that you could potentially see when a caregiver is, going through caregiver burden or fatigue or stress. Next slide. So some things that would help. And on some of these self-coping strategies, will not work for everyone. But outside of this, I know I'm going over self-coping strategies, but one thing that a lot of the caregivers really like is that just respite care, just some time for themselves is really what majority of them want. But some of them don't have access to that or have the ability to do that. So really what we're trying to look for is some of these self-coping strategies. So the first bucket that we've seen that help cope with some of these stressors that these caregivers go is they're really, one thing is their health information. Really, to being able to find this information to make them better caregivers really helps with their coping strategy, and it helps increase that feeling of that caregiving satisfaction that we talked about. Being able to find information about the disease they're taking care of, or especially if it's like the immediate diagnosis that they got, helps them understand more of what to expect with the disease process, what kind of treatments, what kind of disruptions should they expect with work or time out to take to doctor's visits or certain tasks they need to do at home. They want information online, especially if they have to do some medical nursing tasks. For instance, checking insulin or giving medications, or doing some kind of mobility work. Finding this information really helps with their coping, make sure that they're able to do their role correctly and safely as well. Is really the number one thing people are looking for, is the information, really. The next way to help some of these caregivers self-cope is helping find these connections and sharing experiences. With the advent of social media, I know sometimes we think of social media could be detrimental, but for caregivers to help cope with their role, some of them could be very beneficial. Finding support groups is one thing that's very popular with caregivers. so they can cope with what they're going through, even if um, uh, they can't find solutions to a problem, but being able to express what they're going through and feel like they're not the only person going through this is very helpful. And some of these would be support groups, whether it be in person or online. Lots of support resources are out there do provide these online support groups, which is very, very great. And with the improvement of technology, Zoom, like we're on right now, I've looked at a lot of these support groups, and they utilize these tele technology to really reach out, and it kind of crosses borders as well. If you can't find one locally, you can find. I've heard some caregivers even reach out to international support groups to see what's out there for them as well. Another thing is the next one. I've heard some ways of journaling, because not only could it help themselves just to express what they're going through, express their emotions, express their daily routines. One way they can see it on paper, and also help health professionals to see what they're going through. If it's sometimes it's when they go to doctor's visits, or they need to tell someone what they have to go through, they might be forgetting a lot of things. So being able to journal, having a record of what they have to, also gives them a sense of relief that someone can see what they have to go through, or help another caregiver as well to see what the patterns and changes in behavior of a loved one, or what they need to do. Is they saw that as a beneficial way to do so. And last, and again, it's not the only thing out there, are some mindfulness exercises. There's lots of research showing the benefits of, again, we talked about time was a big issue, but some of these mindfulness exercises can take as little as 1 minute to an hour, depending on how much time they have. This is going to include meditation, guided imagery, or breathing exercises. And especially if they have smartphones, there are a lot of applications out there that can help them with some of this that they can do at home, or in the little time they do have to help provide some stress relief, or to help them cope with what they're going through. And some of the support resources that I'll touch upon also have their own, and it could be free, some are at a cost, but a lot of them can be free for these caregivers as well. Next slide. So caregiver resources, there are plenty out there, and I'm only going to touch upon a little bit of what I know is available for us there. But on the internet, there's lots and lots of resources. But I'll touch upon the ones that I found to be helpful, and what others have told me to be helpful. Next slide. So general caregiving resources. So this is just for being a caregiver, or finding help, or just trying to find out what's out there for them. One way, especially here in California, is the California Department of Aging. Tons of information that can help with what we talk about, just health information knowledge. Meals and exercise programs, like that's where a lot of the Meals on Wheels will show up on there. Housing, legal assistance, transportation, respite services as well, and then other important stuff for professionals as well, how to reporting elder abuse or neglect, things like that, and many more. Another caregiving resource is the Family Caregiver Alliance. They have very similar things that what California Department of Aging has, but also can provide additional education, care navigation, links to certain support groups, and then latest information on research and policy, especially surrounding caregivers. Other resources as well, the Family Caregiving Institute, which is based out of UC Davis Health. They also have resources as well on education, information, and local resources as well. And since here I'm located in Orange County, I've worked together with a local organization called the Caregiver Resource Center in Orange County, and they do have it in different other counties as well. But they also have some support information resources available to caregivers that you can give them. Next slide. Last, there are resources for specific populations. Some of these caregivers want, some of these general ones are good for certain general roles, but they want to learn more or want to connect with people in similar situations. Some of these specific population resources could be very helpful. It could be disease specific, such as Alzheimer's. There's multiple Alzheimer's resources out there, like Alzheimer's Association. Again, I'm in Orange County, so Alzheimer's Orange County is a separate one as well. There are other resources, cancer.gov or Parkinson's, but many more depending on the disease specifically that they're looking at. There's other population specific as well. For instance, and I just highlight this because some populations might not find or feel welcomed in some of these other resources, or don't feel like they are inclusive enough. So I just highlight there's, especially for the LGBTQ plus population, there are specific resources for them, especially if they are identified within that population and want to get those specific resources in addition to what they're having to go through. So the LGBTQcaregivers.org is one. Another national resources on LGBTQ aging is another resource for them, which covers a lot of the similar ones that we went over, but gives some specific guidelines or specific resource for that population. There are tons of other population specific based on race, ethnicity, and cultural groups as well. For instance, a lot of religion-based support groups are available, just depending on what they're looking for, and that could be found again either through one of those resources that I've mentioned or Facebook. Facebook has a wealth of these specific support or resources if they're able to access the social media in that way. And I just like to highlight, again, a special population of my interest of what I'm looking for is male caregivers, because what I found is what they're looking for can be very different than other people, especially for the types of support groups. If they want all male support groups, things like that, that could be a popular way. So some of these, just to highlight, Jack's Caregiver Coalition focus on male caregivers, but they also are open to other caregivers of any gender, any type as well. So that's just one for men, and also the men's group is also another popular resource for male caregivers. Next slide. So there are, these are the references, a lot of it coming out of the AARP and a lot of the studies out there, but there is a growing body of knowledge that's going out there. Me, myself, I want to continue caregiver research. But again, those are some basic caregiver resources that found. There's plenty out there, but some good ones to start out with. All right, next. And again, thank you for hearing me out, and any questions or comments.
Thank you so much for that outstanding presentation, Dr. Bueno. Does anyone have any questions for him in regard to his presentation or caregiving?
I have one. I'm just interested, Dr. Bueno, your presentation focused on family members who are caregivers, correct?
Yes.
And so I was kind of wondering what similarities are there when it's not a family member or someone with whom the family's familiar, but someone that has been in that field and has been hired for caregiving. Do you see the same kind of attributes, the same kind of need for respite and support groups, or just sort of interested in that?
There are some similarities, more specific towards helping with specific tasks. For instance, I do a lot of my research on caregivers for Alzheimer's dementia. So the similarities are to how to respond to certain behaviors, especially when it's behavioral. Although the difference with hired help is they might be trained a little bit more, but I do hope that there are programs like, through UCI or others that can help bring some of these family members up in their skills as well. So there are some similarities what they're looking for when it comes to addressing certain behaviors in some of their clients or family members. So there are some similarities there. But the difference is, yes, if what I have seen is those compared that are not family members but are hired, they might be a little bit more skilled. So they're looking for a little bit more psychosocial help. But I do see in some of these support groups, yeah, most of the support groups do focus more on the family members. We don't really see some of these hired. They might have some separate ones that I've seen, especially through Facebook. They have these hired help, some of their support groups, but it's really on the family members. They're really focused on that relationship, which is the big difference, because that's really the big kind of differences because of that caregiving role. There's so much changes within that relationship of who they're taking care of.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions for, let's see if we have something in the chat. Let's see, Lois Heaton says, CG Respite, formerly Hilarity for Charity, has a respite program. Respite care hours, not a cash program. And there's the link there as well. Any other questions for Dr. Bueno? I actually have a question for you. I would like to know what has driven the change in the male to female caregiver ratio, and why are we seeing more male caregivers now, if there's something behind that. And also, when we do encounter a male caregiver, how best can we support them, and how does that support look different than when interacting with a female?
Great questions. And again, this is where my passion for research is. One of the big drivers is that, there was more with that in the past couple of decades, that big drive for more women in the workforce, really, kind of driven that, where there's more men who have to take care of them. And then at least with my research in Alzheimer's and dementia, women are at higher risk to develop those. So technically more of those men, the spouses, are the ones coming into the caregiver role. But another trend that I have seen is there's less of the stigma where a caregiver has to be female. We're starting to see more of that push. And partly this is where I'm trying to say that caregivers come in different and are starting to look very different now. AARP actually 4 years ago came out with this big push, either through social media and through some of their commercials, that kind of encourage men to be caregivers. So we're starting to see that, especially even with millennials, they're starting to see that it's, especially for those, not just family, but for paid, they're seeing that it could be a good profession to be in. Especially I see that in nursing. We're starting to see more men in nursing. So that's kind of to trickle out in other kinds of these gendered, quote unquote, type of roles that we're seeing. So it's a combination of that as well. But hopefully it's really that change in what that societal view of what a caregiver looks like. And then so how to address some of these male caregivers. So again, there's not a lot of research out there right now. I'm starting to do some of my qualitative research, but what I've been finding out is they are looking for different kinds of resources. At least the ones that I've come across, there's this, again, big shift that we're trying to change, but it's not male caregivers are looking for more of the, how to say this, how to fix things rather than the emotional aspects of caregiving. So they're the ones looking for health information. Okay, where do I find it fast? How do I fix this, or how do I address this right away? So from what I'm seeing, is support groups, again, are not really something keen to some of the male support groups, unless it's all male support groups, is what I'm finding. So that's where some of these there's a trend in more of these male only support groups. But how to support it really is just knowing where to find the information fast, where it's easy for them to understand, and where, again, they can address those issues as fast as possible. I see that trend is they want to get to the answer, and they want to get to the answer fast. At least for now, but more research would hopefully will come out to give us a better understanding of how to best. Again, there's not a lot of men not specific to what they're wanting, and a lot of the male caregivers are not even speaking out, so it's hard to capture them, to begin with. And then sometimes they don't even want to be called caregivers. Yeah, they just, if you call someone I've come across one person called them a caregiver, was like, no, I'm not a caregiver. I'm just here to help. So sometimes the label could also be influential in, how we capture that.
Thank you so much. It's just absolutely just really key information. And I really, really appreciate your presentation. Thank you
Yeah.
so very
Thank
much,
you.
Dr. Bueno.